Now we're going to read that term. We're going to read the term quicken and other terms found in this chapter. They are not terms relating to salvation because all of chapter 8 is written to Christians. They are terms relating to that condition in our life when we are close to the Lord, walking in unbroken fellowship. Now, as the Bible teaches us over in the book of 1 John, we cannot walk in fellowship with God if we're not walking in the what? The light. That's what God expects us to walk in. So the first area where God the Holy Spirit works is that He brings conviction to our hearts regarding sin in our lives. Here's a great mistake that we've been making in our Bible-believing churches for many years. If I were to ask from this crowd this evening, name for me a bad sin, we would probably come up with 5 or 10 major sins. We would say that murder is sin. We would say that drunkenness is sin. We would say that adultery is sin. We would say that stealing is sin. We would come up with maybe 5 to 10 major sins that we all agree on are bad sins. By the way, isn't it interesting that those things that we call bad sins are ones that we don't have a problem with? Isn't that rather convenient? I mean, I can enjoy preaching on somebody else's sin. It's when I get on my own sin, that's when I get uncomfortable. Now, what the Holy Spirit does in bringing revival is that God gets us away from our focus on other people's sin, and God points up the sin that's in our lives. I have met many Christians today that have these favorite, shall we call them, laundry list of sins. We're not supposed to, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And I've met a lot of Christians that say, I don't do any of those things, therefore I must be a pretty good Christian. No, you can abstain from all of those major sins. By the way, God doesn't look at them as big sins and little sins. God doesn't color code lies, white lies and green lies and purple lies. To God, sin is sin. But what God the Holy Spirit does is He gets our attention away from saying that we have a false standard, saying, well, so long as I don't do these particular sins, then I must be a pretty good Christian. God takes us away from that and shows us the true condition of our own spiritual heart. Years ago, I should say years ago, back in 1981, so about 9 years ago, my father left the pastorate there in Marshalltown, and the church called me to become the second pastor in the history of that church. Quite a unique opportunity. You have a sort of a similar situation here in that Pastor St. Lawrence's father was a pastor here several years ago, and now the son is here. That's wonderful. It was a real shock to our people up there. They had known me since I was just a little guy. I mean, the same one that they used to yell at for running in church, they now were calling pastor. Well, that was a shock to some of them, you know. Took quite an adjustment, a lot of grace on their part. But it was a thrilling thing as well. They voted us in, a unanimous vote, and there was a great excitement in the church. We already had set a focus that year of trying to set a new record in the history of that church regarding attendance and things of that nature. And we determined that in the first 7 months, during my leadership as pastor, we were going to go ahead and shoot for that goal, and that in the first 7 months, we were going to break every record in the church. Now, you know, I look back on that now, Pastor, and I think that's kind of silly. I mean, the idea that we could really in 7 months top what God had done there in 19 years under my father's leadership. But I think the Lord kind of smiled at our ignorance. And we were excited. The people were thrilled. They had this attitude that we were now in a new generation and a new era in the church. And I watched our people throw themselves into the work of the ministry. Amen. I have never seen God's people work any harder than our folks did in that effort. I watched our people give like I'd never seen them give. I watched our people pray like I'd never seen them pray before. I saw 3 all-night prayer meetings. I attended over 120 adults praying all night before God. And we began to see some amazing things happen. I don't know if it's proper, and we hear this term in sports a lot, if it's proper to use this about the work of the Lord, but if it is, you could sense a momentum in the church. I mean, everybody knew that the church was going forward full speed ahead. And one day, in the midst of all this excitement, and it was exciting, I'll be the first to admit it. One day, in the midst of all this spiritual activity, one day a thought popped into my head. You ever get a thought and you don't even know why you funked it? I mean, just seemed to come from nowhere. All of a sudden, this thought popped into my head, and here was the thought. Dave, what if after all this work and all these prayers and all the anticipation of God's people, Dave, what if there was something in your life that would keep God from blessing this effort? I mean, as soon as I had that thought, I thought, well, that's silly. I'm a good Christian. If you were to ask me, are you a good Christian? I would say, yes, I am. If you were to say, are you doing what a good Christian is supposed to do? I'd say, yes, I am. But you know what? As soon as I dismissed that thought, thinking, that's silly, I dismissed that thought, it kept coming back again. And for several days, that thought just tortured me. I had read in the Bible of what happened to Israel because of one man, Achan's sin. I had learned how that from the scriptures that teach that one person can withhold revival from a whole group. And I thought to myself, I don't want to hinder God's work. One Friday evening, I was at home having supper with Kathy, and I was so troubled in my heart. And finally, we had plans made for that evening, but I finally said, honey, would it bother you if instead of staying home tonight as we had planned, would it bother you if I went back to the church to be alone? She knows me well enough to know when something's bothering me. And she said, no, that's fine. And I went back to the church alone, and there was no one else in the building. I remember I went to my office, I took my Bible, and I took out a blank sheet of notebook paper and a pencil, and I got down on my knees. There on my knees, I opened my Bible to Psalm 139. And there on my knees, I prayed David's prayer. There at the end of that psalm, in the last two verses, David said, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, and know my thoughts. And see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And on my knees, I said, Lord, you know my heart. Dear Lord, I don't want anything to stand in your way. Lord, if there's anything in my heart that displeases you, I want you to bring it to my mind. I'm going to make a list here in front of you, and I will not leave my knees until you have your way in every area of my heart. Now, you know, as soon as I said, is there anything in my life that displeases you, right off the bat, I did think of a couple things. I mean, if we were all honest tonight, every one of us ought to be at the altar confessing sin. There's no one here that is perfect. But I thought to myself that night, I thought, I'm so sincere before the Lord, why God might show me maybe 10 things that displease Him. Well,